We're joined today by Dr. Kate Guthrie, who works at Leeds Teaching Hospitals and who is here to share some of the work that her and colleagues are leading on to get patients home earlier in the day. Kate, thanks for joining. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing, and particularly what drove you to explore the project in the first instance?
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Dr. Kate Guthrie. I'm a clinical leadership fellow currently at Leeds Teaching Hospitals, but an elderly medicine registrar by trade, and joining back into the throng not so short a time. So I suppose answering the kind of last point of why we're trying to get patients home sooner. So hospitals are currently operating at full capacity, and with late afternoon discharges, we know that has a massive impact on admission delays and overcrowding in ED. And prolonged ED stays are associated with poor patient outcomes and decreased patient satisfaction.
Absolutely.
And if you're being discharged later on in the day, that's a poor patient experience in yourself. If you're being told at 9 o'clock in the morning you can go home and you're waiting all day when all you want to do is get home to your dog, cat, family, that's not a good experience. But it also has a massive impact on staff experience.
For sure.
So we was, no one wants to see their patient waiting all day, but also we was having reports that those that were out of hours kind of working was experiencing very sick patients coming up from ED with less number of staff, and it just felt a little bit more unsafe. So as a trust, we wanted to try and get people discharged earlier in the day, and we wanted to try and understand what was going on to cause that, so we could try and target it to try and get it better. So we started looking at a weekly measurement of the number of patients discharged by 3 p.m, but we focused on patients that had been in hospital over 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason for that is because if someone had arrived, say, at 5 o'clock in the morning and they've got home at 7 o'clock and it's less than 24 hours, actually that's probably good practice and we needed to get them out. But if they've been in a little while longer, we should be able to get them out earlier in the day. So when we started this project, it's been going on a little while, since 2019, but my role started last year in about August time, and at that point as a trust we were discharging about 34% of our patients, and since then, as part of the collaborative and some of the work that we've been doing, we've really improved that to about 40% as a trust as a whole. But there's some of our CSUs, our departments, that are actually discharging 50% of their patients before 3 p.m.
Which is incredible, isn't it, when you think about it?
Yeah, and the step improvements that we've had has been incredible, and it's thanks to the work and collaborative working and sharing of those changes that has led to that change.
So let's get to the nuts and bolts then. What did you do? So how, I guess, as a doctor working in the hospital, did you go about corralling that support and making that case for change? I know that Leeds Teaching Hospitals obviously has an improvement method, which is particularly quite active and working on, but there's something I think about the sustainability of this improvement, obviously, if you've been working on it for a few years, that I think is probably quite important to touch on as well.
Yeah, so as you said, there's the Leeds improvement method, which incorporates lots of different elements to try and tackle a difficult problem, including quality improvement. And some of it was thinking about education. So discharging a patient is a complex problem and has to go through a complex process that involves lots of different people. And sometimes, particularly when you're under pressure, it's very easy to focus on one little aspect and one little problem, which is normally your problem. And you don't realise what the whole process involves. So some of it was just trying to understand the whole process and making sure that everyone else understands every other person's role.
Yeah.
And we did, and those challenges, though, that are in that process are different for every department. And so we did a bit of work which was trying to understand what are staff perceiving as barriers. So we did a staff survey to really get to the grips of that kind of human element. But we also did a deep dive into data, as in what's happening for individual patients that are discharged after 3 o'clock.
Yeah.
To try and understand and identify the avoidable and unavoidable and avoidable delayed discharges and what's happening. And that was shared with the wards. So it meant that they could come up with solutions and test interventions that they feel that could work.
Yeah.
So they had that ownership and could work collaboratively together. So as part of this kind of breakthrough collaborative as the discharge collaborative, we was able to help support individual wards, individual teams to make those changes. And then through the regular meetings, through data being recorded and shared across the whole trust, we was able to spread that learning and spread success throughout across the whole trust. And there's certain interventions that we use to try and do that with the teams that they developed.
That sounds fantastic, Kate. And I think as leaders, we all have strong views, don't we, about the things we perceive to be problems or barriers. But I'm interested, did the results surprise you? Were they what you expected?
It did surprise me in certain aspects. More the difference between sometimes the perceived challenges. So I think as a doctor, I always think, it's the waiting for the transport, or I'm waiting for pharmacy to do their meds bit.
Yeah.
Or I'm waiting for the nurse to check the medication before they can go. Those are the bits that are delayed.
The usual suspects.
The usual suspects, but it wasn't necessarily those aspects.
Okay.
So some of it was writing. Some of it was unsurprisingly not writing the e-meds early enough, but sometimes it was the awareness that the e-meds and the EDAN had been separated. So you don't have to sit and do it all in one go. You can do your e-meds first and start that process. A lot of the doctors didn't realise that whole process from writing your e-meds initially to having them on the ward and letting them go was about 4 hours.
So it's back to everybody understanding that whole pathway, isn't it, rather than the bit that they may or may not be responsible for. So lessons for everybody then to consider. And when you and I spoke and met before planning for this podcast, I think you talked to me quite passionately about 2 things which I thought we could explore a little bit further. I know you've done some work exploring the use of a discharge board to support kind of everybody's knowledge and understanding of priorities, and also the golden patient. So would you like to talk to us a little bit about those 2 things?
Yeah, you'll probably get me on my high horse for this one. So the discharge board has been probably quite instrumental in a lot of wards. And essentially it's a board that is adapted depending on the ward of what they need. But the key aspects is discharges for today and discharges tomorrow. So it's basically thinking about tomorrow's discharges today.
Yeah.
And a lot of wards in Leeds, and pretty much all of them, have got either a daily huddle or an MDT, where they discuss the patients, think about the safety falls aspects, but really come together as a multidisciplinary team to make a plan for the patient for the future. And essentially it's become incorporated within that, and it helps junior doctors, nursing staff, pharmacists to plan their day. Because if you just have one big long list of discharges, you can't prioritise, and you're not going to always think about those tomorrow. But some wards have incorporated about transport. Has it been booked for the next day? Some of them have incorporated if there's any investigations outstanding. It's dependent on the ward, but it's an integral part, and actually has become part of our perfect ward metrics. So we know which wards have got a discharge board and who hasn't, and whether it's actually being used and up to date as well as part of those measures.
I really like the fact, Kate, that there is a principle suggested that people have been given the freedom and the flexibility to customize that to be meaningful to the environment they are kind of working in. And I think that means that it then can be responsive in the way that they need it to, can't it?
Yeah, and each ward is very individual in how they're using it as well. So on some of our acute wards, it's very much utilised by the doctors because they want to have that control of going, I'm going to tick this off when it's done. Where there's another ward on one of our elderly medicine wards where it is guarded within an inch of its life by the discharge coordinator. But that's because that's almost her communication with the rest of the team, but also it works really well. And that ward in particular is getting about 78% of their patients out the door by 3. She's amazing.
There is a process there, but ownership across both of those examples you've given me is just as important, isn't it? So I guess what we're saying is that it doesn't matter who owns it as long as somebody does. And then it's how that kind of helps brings everybody's actions together.
Yeah, and it's thinking about the next day today is probably a key message. There's no point in just thinking about today, which is important, but to be able to prepare earlier, you need to actually think about things earlier.
And that leads us to the golden patient, I think, quite nicely. So how does that work in practice, Kate? Who leads on that?
So a lot of the time that's the nursing staff. So it works particularly well in patients that are going home with reablement or CCB, or need some sort of support where you find out normally relatively late the day before that there's a bed, for example, or there's availability.
Yeah. CCB is your community beds, is that right?
Yeah, community care beds. And sometimes discharge to assess bed, we sometimes use the same terminology. But essentially, when a community bed is available, we tend to find out either early that morning or the day before that they're going home or going to the bed. And a lot of the time it's picked up by the nursing staff that's happening. And we're working really hard on those that haven't got a reason to reside to have their letters at least prepared or as good as they can be, so there's only a few edits before they actually are discharged. So the nursing staff essentially recognise that patient can go home. If it's before 2:00 the previous day, they will sort out transport. If not, it's handed over first thing to be booked and released. And that's communicated and led to get that person home as early as possible, essentially. And it's normally before 10:00. And it's normally one patient that you have to recognise that can go home in the morning, let everyone know, have everything organised and get them home. And there's a lot of different issues that are utilising that, not just for kind of community beds, but that's where we've seen it work the best.
In both cases and examples, I guess the kind of the important thing is kind of galvanizing everybody to a kind of a core list, isn't it? And almost, making sure that everybody is, I guess, aware and kind of understands who the priority patients in the context of discharge, of course, because there'll be plenty of other jobs the wards needs to get done are for the day. Kate, I must ask, we talk a lot about the importance of kind of ward rounds. I think you've kind of described it as a daily huddle, but how important or how instrumental has it been as a process to allow you to bring the whole project together?
I think it's making use of what's there. And in Leeds, I have to admit, it's very much integrated that there needs to be a multidisciplinary team, that everyone comes together and has a plan for their patients. And so it's almost slotted in as second nature. As another part that is an integral part of that patient's journey. And it ties into some of the MDT work that we've been doing in communication for better outcomes for our patients, where we have an MDT pro forma. thinking about what's going on with the patient now, what's their next goal, what do we need to do to get this person home, and when do we think about those discharges? And they tie in really well with what we need to communicate to our patients as well. So we're talking about kind of 4 patient questions. So does the patient know what's wrong with them? Do they know what's going to happen later today, tomorrow, this week? And what do they need to achieve to get home? And what should I expect when I go home? And they're 4 key questions that we should be communicating to each other, but also the patient, so that everyone is on the same hymn sheet and know exactly what needs to happen to go home and when that sort of time frame will be, so that we can start planning ahead, not just recognising them at 12 o'clock on that day that they can go home.
And I guess for complex patients and complex discharges, that makes such a big difference, doesn't it? Because although, you know, the word discharge might sound simple, we know that the process in some cases can be anything but. Kate, we're nearing the end. I just have one final question for you, and there'll be plenty of people hopefully listening to this podcast who are thinking about a similar project. What have you learned over the course of the last kind of couple of years that you think could help others looking to do something similar?
I think you need to create time for this sort of project as part of your role. I've had the privilege of this has been my pure focus this year as part of the clinical leadership fellow. And that's, I think, what's probably led and helped with those improvements. There's someone that is having that time and endless enthusiasm, because unfortunately it's a complex problem and there isn't going to be a quick fix. And I think the other key thing is you need to be aware of assumptions. There can be perceptions of what is causing delays and what actually is causing delays. And until you start digging, you're not going to find out if you're tackling the right problem. And I think it's really important to have accurate and timely data. We're having data every 2 weeks, and that really helps us keep an eye on, but also feedback to staff how well, or if there's something not quite right, so we can celebrate and make staff feel appreciated in a time that's particularly challenging at the moment.
And I guess feedback is probably the nicest way we can think of ending this podcast. So what feedback have you had from patients and staff about this so far?
I think staff are feeling a sense of achievement and being thanked, and having certificates has really helped. So I was mentioning to you earlier that we give basically certificates to anyone that's having particularly amazing discharge, or if they're having step improvements. And if the CSU as a whole is having improvements, we're having virtual celebration events, and that's really tying in with the executives. You know, it's one of their key aims is to try and get people discharged half a day sooner, but it's kind of having that connection between senior staff and those that are on the front line that are doing that work and making them feel appreciated. And that's been probably the best part of my job this year. And patients are just happy to be leaving earlier in the day.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate. And celebrating success absolutely is something I think that we always should and be wanting to do more of. That has been really helpful, and I'm sure will be of incredible value to kind of colleagues listening. So for those listening, thank you also for joining us, and I hope that the discussion supports you with any work that you might be doing in this respect. Thanks, everybody.